Nzioka Waita.
Good morning, everyone. I can see very many friendly and familiar faces. First, let me thank the organizers of the Shared Value Summit for inviting me here today. I don't usually do these events, but I am an evangelist for the Big Four, and it's my job to engage all stakeholders across the board and educate them as to what the Big Four is all about and how its purpose to benefit the country. So on your tables, you'll see a document like this. And this document is a takeaway pack. It basically helps you to understand the investment opportunities that the private sector can access in the context of the Big Four. I'll try very hard not to, is this the clicker? Or which one? This one. So I'll try very hard not to repeat what you already know so that I can use the 15 or so minutes I have really discussing what government's perspective of shared value is in the context of the Big Four. So now the magic button. We have a budget of about 2.7 trillion shillings. If you net off wage bills, which come to about 670 billion shillings across both national and county governments, you are left with development and recurrent expenditure roughly at about 1.5 to 2 billion, to 2 trillion shillings every year. Now, governments exist. The raison d'etre for government is to serve its people and to help them to achieve prosperity at communal and at individual level. This work cannot be done by government alone. It must be done through various actors. Business community, non-state actors, the civil society, religious organizations, community-based outfits that really serve to connect government services to the people at the lowest denomination of governance. When we look at the Big Four in terms of its aspirations, what immediately jumps out is the fact that this aspiration, if you were to cost it, runs into trillions of shillings. But this aspiration is not one where the government is going to remove money from its pocket to pay for. It's going to create the correct environment, the policy environment, to create a regime in which these three actors working closely together in concert can then achieve this vision of ours called the Big Four. So we have a youth problem. The median age in Kenya is 19 and a half years, sorry. Money on my mind. 19 and a half years. And perhaps on the continent, we have the most connected youth in terms of their access to information. So they know what is going on across the world. They know when they're getting a raw deal. And more importantly, they know what a prosperous future looks like because they can see it. What frustrates a lot of young people is that they don't feel that this prosperity is coming to them soon enough. And this is the challenge that governments have to deal with. In a democratic environment where governments change every 5 years, administrations change every 5 years, you have to remain conscious that the voting population continues to get younger and younger. And their needs are changing dramatically. Which is why when we conceptualized the Big Four, it really was based on what we call a national household survey. And the four things that came out, one, of course, is our young people would like jobs, wherever those jobs will come from, because they want to earn a livelihood in a dignified environment. Number two is food is expensive in Kenya. If I was to take a comparison, just on a desktop evaluation, If you're to buy a chicken, a whole chicken, Roadrunner, many of you knows what the Roadrunner is. In Kenya, on average, it will cost you about 800 shillings. In Mozambique, it will cost you 200 shillings. Now, when your disposable income becomes extremely tied to, number one, the need to feed yourself and your family. Number two, the ability for you to treat and medicate and have a healthy household. Number three is to be able to put a roof over your head in a healthy and respectable way and space. These three things are factual. Whenever anyone asks about how did you decide which of the big four, which of these pillars you'd settle on, those three issues underpin the real situation in the country. We spend too much money out of pocket for healthcare. We spend too much money on food and don't get value for it at the cost that we pay. And number three is that most people would prefer to live in better environment. So if you are renting a home, you would want to get value for money for what you're paying. If you wanted to build your home, you would want not to bankrupt yourself in the process. Number three, if you want to live somewhere, you would want access to clean water, sanitation, security, and all the amenities that attach thereto. And this is how we came up with these priorities as opposed to other priorities. Now, immediately, you can see even from the information pack that I've shared, is that there is huge opportunity for private sector to play a critical part. And just framing everybody's role within the shared value prism, or looking at it through that perspective, I've just done a small graphic to indicate the role of business vis-a-vis the role of government. And at the very beginning, you'll be able to determine that business actually and non-state actors are the most critical component of the big four. For instance, when we look at education, education in part is delivered by government by preparing the curriculum, looking at the welfare of teachers, but the biggest disconnect today we have, primarily from the corporate sector, is that the product of our educational institutions is not fit for purpose. So a lot of panel beating needs to happen after university or after some form of tertiary education. And you find that the private sector has to take a lead in developing curricula that are more suitable for their business aspirations. A case in point would be some of the large infrastructure programs that are being carried out across the country. One of my pet peeves has always been the inability, when you walk through a construction site, there are no straight lines. If you carry a spirit level or a tape measure, you are guaranteed to find poor quality work even in the most sophisticated of buildings, because we lost a huge component of our blue-collar trainees, because somehow we managed to convince our young people that the only pathway to prosperity was university. So we saw a multiplication in the number of universities offering courses that are very bizarre. I think our Cabinet Secretary for Education may have said this in other fora, but one of the most popular courses in Kenya is supply chain management. And no guessing why. Everyone wants to make a procurement decision, and not because they have any expertise of some sort, but it's because they feel that that is the easiest way for them to land resources into their own pockets. So there is some space to do. We need to change our approach to tertiary education to make these people more suitable either to be entrepreneurs in and of themselves, or to be fit for purpose for the new generation of industries that are coming through and have the potential to create jobs for our young people. Secondly, is just looking at where do the opportunities lie. So yesterday, His Excellency the President went to tour one of our anchor housing programs in Ngara, what we call the Park Road development. In that development, you have already 600 people employed as builders, masons, carpenters, general laborers, glaziers, electricians, and all manner of practical, technical, vocational skills. But the reality is we don't have enough of those people. If we were to widen the scale for housing based on our aspiration today, there will be a huge shortage of these specialists. And it's why we have indicated as a key enabler within the Big Four the need to really relook at our technical and vocational training. For us to be able to say that vocational training is cool. It's cool because as soon as you finish that course, you are guaranteed a job. You are guaranteed a legitimate source of income and one that allows you to contribute to the economy. We also look at where do the opportunities lie for private sector in all of these environments. And again, if I refer you back to that, the chart on the screen, you'll see that for government, it's really about creating the correct ecosystem. Creating the correct ecosystem for knowledge sharing, for infrastructure improvement, for taxes and taxation to give the appropriate and correct incentives to business, looking at the role of law and order and access to justice, because that's a key enabler for business. And lastly, looking just at the entire ecosystem, policy ecosystem, that will enable business to operate in a predictable way and make longer-term decisions. Now, I don't want to read this slide for slide. I will take it as a given that everyone understands the opportunities that exist. My real message today is what I'll jump to, which is what will stop us from achieving shared value in the context of the Big Four. So we are going to do create 500,000 new homeowners. In the last 6 months, what have I witnessed from private sector? At least 50% of the people who have engaged us on housing are more interested in making a quick buck and a killing. They are not interested in the objective of providing dignified homes to Kenyan citizens. And that's a problem that resides largely, if I was to draw a line in the room, on that side, where you are. Because people are happy as businessmen to look at the bottom line without necessarily thinking about the ethical challenges that they must address. So I'll ask you, if there is no willingness to share the cake, can we really achieve shared value? So an example would be in the coffee space. For every 100 shillings that a coffee farmer, worth of coffee that a farmer would produce, our farmers here would typically get between 14 and 20 shillings. And that's not a problem of government. That's a problem largely of the private sector. Because today, premium coffee from Kirinyaga County, I'll give you an example, would be sold at almost 800 shillings per kilo. The farmer in Kirinyaga will get less than 100 shillings. The coffee sector has been built on smallholder farms with volunteer workers, mostly children and women who go in to pick coffee berries. The profits made at the apex of coffee trading don't seem to appreciate that in a country like Kenya that produces one of the best quality coffees, both for blending and for direct consumption, is that the coffee sector will die. It will die because there refuses to be an acceptance that the farmers must get better value for their coffee, for them to stop cutting their trees down to build empty, big residential estates that are empty. And many of you have driven on the metropolitan side of Nairobi, where you go into Limuru and parts of Kiambu, which were under tea and coffee, and now they're huge housing estates, maybe 20% uptake in those housing estates. But we have put entire generations out of business. We have turned our farmers into speculators for land. And the reason for this is because we refuse to share value. So for me, that would be challenge number one. The people who mill are private. The people who export are private. The people who do the last value addition for coffee and retail it are private sector. How is it possible that they can continue to profit without passing these benefits down the food chain? Something will give. And I refer you back to my opening statement. 19 and a half years is the average age of your population. If you cannot convince these children to go and take up agriculture and food production, they won't do it because there's no money. They're not fools. They're not going to go spend time in a farm if they don't see compensation coming through at a proportionate value. So what happens to that entire food chain? Coffee starts to diminish, quality starts to disappear, and the guy at the apex eventually becomes an endangered species because they have profited without looking at the entire value chain. And this works across different spectra. I can say the same thing for potatoes, I can say the same thing for horticulture and what we call business cash crops. The farmer gets the short end of the stick. In fact, the average daily income, household income for farmers is 600 shillings. Why would this person spend so much energy doing this farming if they cannot see corresponding value come into it? And for a country that 27% of its GDP comes from agriculture, this is a real and present danger. Number two, is the business community willing to rethink their approach to intellectual property rights? And where does this come in? Many of you might be privy to a conversation that's been happening in the United States Senate about the role of innovation. And specifically here, a drug for the treatment of HIV called Truvada, where a month's course of treatment on average is $2,000 in the United States. Across the globe in Australia, the same drug is sold at $8. It's inconceivable that a company would want to profit on an issue such as this. Where we sit in government, it becomes a bigger and bigger concern, because if we're looking at healthcare and giving universal coverage to over 50 million Kenyans, then we must look at the entire chain of the health provision, from the infrastructure to the drugs. The cost of drugs in Kenya is absolutely off kilter. It's something that is so worrying that you find in every homestead, on average, for every 1,000 shillings, over 260 shillings is spent out of pocket for health-related expenditure. Most of this is paying too much for drugs, and we're still paying too much for drugs that in most instances are counterfeit. So when you try to explain to an ordinary person that you would want them to have good quality health care, they can't relate, because their reality every day is that they are paying for the price for intellectual property, because that's the justification that is used. Now, the raison d'etre for government I mentioned at the beginning is to serve its people, So the government cannot continue to watch key commodities continuing to be overpriced on such essential social services. And rather than have an antagonistic and adversarial relationship with the business community, it's better now, within the framework of shared value, that businesses start to take longer-term positions. It will cost you nothing by selling these drugs at a more affordable cost, because the government can guarantee you a supply chain. We can guarantee you patients. We can ensure that your drug is purchased and that we can deal with counterfeiters. But the unwillingness to compromise on this is actually what has led to the increase in counterfeits. Because if, for example, a round of chemotherapy can run into hundreds of thousands of shillings every month, and the cost of that drug is 90% IP, 1% ingredients, that is not sustainable. And even if it's not now, inevitably people will fight, there will be conflict, and governments will have to take populist positions, including even what is being discussed in the US Senate about drug price controls. Because the people must be healthy. A government can be removed on the basis of inability to provide access to affordable health care. So something I would want you to reflect on. Lastly, and Bob mentioned this in his address, is the willingness to accept that 50% of the problem in corruption in Kenya and in Africa is sitting again on that side of the room. The KRA officers who are now being interdicted are being interdicted because they received bribes to massage taxation figures, but they didn't bribe themselves. I don't know, how many of you think they bribed themselves? Everyone is in a panic right now because in the new legal regime that allows for plea bargaining, we expect the KRA officers to throw quite a number of people under the bus. Most of those people, again, will be sitting on that side of the room. So when we talk about the willingness to confront corruption in the context of shared value, is that if we are unable to have a grown-up discourse about the role of the private sector, the role of non-state actors in aiding and abetting corrupt and unethical practices, then it is impossible for the government to unilaterally deal with official graft. And it's important that I pass on this message because there is a lot of pressure on this administration to crack the whip on corruption based on sentiment. We have to be careful not to allow the war on corruption to become a McCarthyism situation, which is built on witch hunting. Evidence-based prosecutions must lead the way. We must give room to law and order to take precedence in this war on corruption. But the private sector must acknowledge that they cannot survive, this country cannot survive until you say enough is enough. And I would find it very difficult for us to achieve shared value unless we can confront in an honest way these three challenges. One, to be able to take a longer-term view. Make investments that last. not short-term exploitation of people and citizens and customers. Number two, particularly in the healthcare space and the agriculture space, let's deal with the question of IPR from a social benefit perspective. Because at the end of the day, there is no point in selling a drug to people who can't afford to pay it. Number three, as I close, would really be the question of corruption. This discussion is so hot because it involves so much emotion. People can see when there is pressure, particularly on businesses to pay taxes. There is pressure on individuals to comply with the law. So it's not hard to understand where the frustrations come from when people feel that the war against corruption is not moving at the pace that it ought to move. But I would like to give you comfort that number one is that the rule of law will prevail. Number two, that the business community, in order to achieve genuine shared value on the Big Four programs, must abandon unethical business practices and must not be part of the problem on corruption. I can write a book about government tendering processes and how the phone calls come to government officials from that side of the room, where they would want to see government policies tailored not for the benefit of the majority, but for the benefit of individual organizations so that they might profit ahead of their competition. I don't think it's sustainable, and I don't think it will help us achieve shared value across the board if we are not able to confront these issues. I thank you very much for listening. I will stay here for most of the morning, and if anyone would want to discuss this on a one-to-one basis, I will be at your disposal. Thank you very much.